All right, guys, welcome to chapter 19. The opening story is really looking at the polar bear and pointing out that the primary reason for the decline is climate change. The decline of the species is climate change. This is just a quick warm up. Maybe you can think back to chapter 15 about what chemicals are involved in global warming and also an ozone depletion. Try to think about the human causes, why these gases are increasing, what layer of the atmosphere they're in, some of the environmental effects and human health effects. So just to kind of get you on track, for global warming, you could certainly have things like methane, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and for ozone depletion, CFCs would be a good one. And then really try to do this on your own, but it's a very good review. All right, these are just some names for climate change. You can call it global change, global warming, global climate change, etc. But basically, it's just really looking at various names for the same problem. The greenhouse effect, I think most of you have heard of this and are somewhat familiar with it. Excuse me. And it's just got that name because the gases that are released that create the greenhouse effect trap the infrared radiation or heat in a similar way as a gardening or greenhouse would do. It's really important for you to understand the inputs and outputs of this type of a system. So review this figure and just really feel comfortable in saying, okay, you know what's coming in, you know what's going out, and you know that typically inputs and outputs would be equal if you're in steady state, and if not, you're not in steady state. All right, the greenhouse gases are various, and some are more prevalent than others, and some are more potent than others. So that's just kind of an important distinction to make. Carbon dioxide is very prevalent, whereas methane is extremely potent. Notice here that both types of ozone are listed here, both low-level ozone or tropospheric ozone and stratospheric ozone as contributors to greenhouse gases. All right, there's some natural releases of these greenhouse gases, and often these are cited for support for climate change deniers. All right, in this slide is really looking at some of the proof that scientists use to indicate changes in climate change and what the links are that's causing these changes. Note the consistent spike up and spike down within a 1 year period of time. That is noted because of seasonal variations. And so, again, the northern hemisphere has significantly more landmass than the southern hemisphere, and the patterns that we see in the northern hemisphere are what dominate these graphs. This is CO2, and if you overlay CO2 with temperature, you'll find that both are rising at approximately the same rate. This was something that Al Gore used in his Inconvenient Truth. This is more a documentation, just showing surface temperatures. And this is looking at historical data. One way of gathering historical data. So using ice cores for indirect measurements to show both abiotic and biotic factors that influence climate change. All right, so kind of combining all of these things, we know that increases in certain gases, in particular CO2, causes a greater capacity for warming. We know that as Earth experiences higher temperatures, the oceans warm and often don't contain as much CO2. Therefore, they're releasing it. And what we're trying to understand and what we're using to help drive some of the models that are made to predict what will happen with climate change are these feedback loops that we'll get into shortly. But you're basically looking at, excuse me, how the feedback loops work together. And it's really complicated. So if you, okay, again, just as a reminder, the feedback loops, if it's a positive feedback loop, that basically means that it continues to move in one direction. So in the example I just presented, the more CO2, the higher the temps, the greater the CO2 that gets released, and again, the higher the temp. So it just keeps on going in that upward direction. Whereas a negative feedback loop returns back to an original state, or at least very close to that original state. All right, looking at some specific feedback loops. The loop on photosynthesis. Again, you can look at this and you can see where there would be ways that photosynthesis could increase the reduction of carbon dioxide, but it can also result in additional CO2 being emitted. Particulate matter and global cooling. Again, sort of a yin and yang here, but we know that particulate matter has a way of blocking light from coming in, and scattering light, so it can potentially reduce the amount of sunlight that hits the earth. However, with Clean Air Acts implemented, Clean Air Laws, implemented, we're seeing that perhaps these aerosols have actually decreased the amount of warming that we're seeing. All right, the albedo effect. I know we've talked about this quite some time, but as a reminder, albedo is the reflective property of a surface, and so the greater the albedo, the more heat is deflected. Light sources have a higher albedo effect. Oceans, of course, looking specifically at temperatures, leading to either the absorption of CO2 or the release of CO2. In either event, the outcome is not pleasant. If you increase more carbon dioxide in your oceans, you're going to have a more acidic ocean. A slight change in the pH is all that's needed for many mollusks and crustaceans to lose their shell or weaken their shell, and an increase or release of CO2 would contribute more to global warming. Cloud cover is very similar to aerosols in the sense that you would think that with an increase of cloud covering, you might have a cooling effect because it's blocking, or it could potentially trap warm air from leaving. Permafrost, again, this is something that is significant because melting permafrost really releases significant amounts of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. We've already seen parts of Alaska and Siberia where permafrost is melting. Not only does it release methane, but it creates really unstable land environments for any building structures. So whether you're talking about infrastructure like highways, the Alaskan pipeline, homes, buildings, industry, the land is very unstable. All right, a couple of consequences to the environment because of global warming, melting polar ice caps, the melting of glaciers, which could reduce the amount of fresh water for millions of people who rely on glacial water, melting of the permafrost, rising sea levels due to melting glaciers and ice sheets, more extreme heat waves, drier, hotter, cold spells, change in precipitation patterns, increase in storm intensity, and shift in ocean currents. All this leading to changes in food supply. Consequences to living organisms. Well, the bottom line is that we feel that diversity will decline with increasing temperatures. Growing seasons will be varied, and Animals and plants often have limited tolerance levels to that. Humans may also have to relocate and actually are already relocating in some island communities. And then water wars have happened in the past, and there's concern that they may become more prevalent in the future. Right, so how do we deal with climate change? Well, it is difficult. There are a couple of ways that you might do this, but because the problem is global, some countries contribute more than others in terms of pollutants. There's a time delay. So even though we have emitted some of these chemicals for 100 years or so, there's been such a delay that the cause and the consequence are often hard to connect. The effects last a long time. It's a political issue. The benefits and harmful impacts are not evenly spread. And many actions that might reduce it could cause economic and lifestyle changes for other countries who can't afford to make those changes. So in dealing with climate change, there's mitigation or strategies to reduce the greenhouse gases, improve energy efficiency. You can do stuff like tax energy, provide breaks, those sorts of things. So again, jot down a couple of these as methods for, again, individuals or corporations or governments to reduce greenhouse gases. Reducing fossil fuels, store and sequester existing and future carbon emissions, protect forests from deforestation and replant destroyed areas. And in terms of adaptations, people, communities, people, individuals will have to move away from coasts. Those are a couple of things. Invest in storm barriers and flood control measures. So that might mean something like creating natural wetlands and protecting tidal dunes. So these are just a few mitigations and adaptation strategies. Make sure you've got a couple of those in your back pocket for your exam day. Okay, cap and trade emissions and trading schemes. This is just a quick video that explains how this process works.
Global warming. Sea levels are on the rise. The weather is becoming increasingly more extreme and unpredictable. Species after species face extinction, and severe water shortage threatens dry regions. All of these are direct consequences of our greenhouse gas emissions, and a trend we must stop now. Tradable carbon units are one of the most effective weapons in the battle for a better environment. But what is a carbon unit? A carbon unit is a permit to emit 1 ton of CO2. This is equal to the emissions of a one-way flight from Oslo to Bangkok for one person, or 5 months of driving by an average Norwegian motorist. So how does the emission trading scheme actually work? The emission trading scheme determines how much CO2 and other greenhouse gases we can emit. In 1997, most of the countries in the world signed the Kyoto Protocol. The aim of this agreement is that all industrialized countries should reduce their total emissions of greenhouse gases by at least 5% from 2008 to 2012, compared to their emissions in 1990. The UN distributes quotas of carbon units to those industrialized countries that have signed the treaty. These units set a limit on the level of emissions. This limit is equivalent to the total amount of CO2 that these countries are permitted to emit, and which is less than the anticipated emissions. Some countries are so successful in reducing their emissions that they simply don't need all the carbon units they've been allocated, while other countries may struggle to reduce their emissions and need more units. Countries may, therefore, buy and sell carbon units. The price of tradable units depends on how many there are in circulation. Similar to a stock exchange, prices vary according to supply and demand. Each country is individually responsible for deciding how to cut its emissions. Heavy industry is often responsible for a large share of a country's CO2 emissions. Many countries have therefore decided that these industries must make the largest contribution towards emission reductions. Let's look at an example. Factory A and B have both been allocated carbon units by their authorities. Factory A decides to reduce its emissions by implementing climate-friendly measures. Their reduction efforts are in fact so successful that they have carbon units to spare. These can then be sold. Factory B, on the other hand, is unable to reduce its emissions and has to buy carbon units from Factory A, for instance. However, Factory B can also cover its emissions by investing in CO2 reducing measures in Factory C, which is located in a developing country. Although this country does not have any obligations under the Kyoto Protocol, the UN can still approve the emission reductions and give Factory B carbon units equivalent to the reductions in Factory C. So, regardless of whether Factory B buys units from Factory A or C, the result is reduced emissions.
That's the hopeful result, is reduced emissions. All right, the Kyoto Protocol, you might remember hearing about this. This was an agreement that was not signed by the United States in 1997. And part of the reason why it was not signed by the US is because the developed nations, in particular India and China, the feeling was that they were given an economic advantage over US markets, and that wasn't something that at the time, I think it was George W. Bush was willing to sign off on. But the goal of the Kyoto Protocol was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from industrialized countries below 1990 levels by a certain year. The Paris Agreement is the more recent international convention, and you might recall hearing about that perhaps last year or the year before. What the Paris Agreement is looking at, again, looking at greenhouse gases, but it's really trying to focus on ambitious climate change adaptations, things that will help enhance and support all developing nations. So the Kyoto Protocol kind of alluded to that with the cap and trade effort in terms of, giving company C money to enhance their operations. And this is looking more at sharing more of that technology. This conference is also known as the 21st Conference of the Parties, or COP21. And then our last section is about carbon sequestration, which is a little bit different than carbon trading. It's not, you're not trading the carbon, you're bearing the carbon. You're putting it away for future reference. And I've got a short little video that just shows how this works, and some of the concerns with this type of sequestration are that it would be unstable in terms of the geology.
Forest fires burn millions of acres in the United States each year, and they all begin with a source of heat.
Oh, this is the wrong video. Sorry, kids. Hang on. Sorry. All right, let me go back to this. I tried doing this ahead of time so that you wouldn't get stuck watching a commercial, but instead I've forwarded more than where I wanted to go. So here we go. So I think you're going to see a commercial. Sorry.
Everybody on the floor! This is a robbery!
Mr. Johnson? Eric Johnson?
How does she know your name?
Okay.
on the
Oh
floor!
my
This is
goodness.
a robbery!
Mr. Johnson? Eric Johnson?
How does she know your name?
To fight against global warming, the world needs to sharply reduce emissions of carbon dioxide gas, which traps heat in the atmosphere. Power plants that burn coal or other fossil fuels emit much of that CO2, but a technology called carbon capture and storage, or CCS, can keep the gas out of the environment. When fossil fuels are burned, molecules of CO2 are produced along with other gases. In a carbon capture system, before going up the smokestack, this mixture of gases is sprayed with a chemical that attaches only to the CO2. The chemical is then heated to release the gas, producing a stream of pure carbon dioxide that's compressed and sent through a pipeline to a well. The chemical is recycled and used again and again. At the well, the CO2 is injected deep underground, where it spreads out into porous layers of rock and sand. Impermeable rock layers above act as a cap, preventing the gas from rising up and eventually out into the atmosphere. In theory, at least, the gas should stay buried forever. But CCS is expensive, and because it requires so much heat and power, it cuts the electrical output of a generating plant by as much as 20%. As a result, the technology has been slow to be adopted. The pace will have to pick up, scientists say, if the world is to reduce the impact of climate change.
Right. And so basically, guys, that concludes much of what we needed to talk about for chapter 19, climate change. And I hope what you got out of that was that there are certain, there's evidence that supports climate change, that there's regulations, international regulations to try to combat climate change, and that there's technology used to try to decrease the amount of carbon that we're releasing in the environment. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a good day.